And so when we look at slavery in Brooklyn, when we look at that first census that comes out, most of those names should look familiar. The first federal census was taken in 1790, just 5 years after the American Revolution ended. And here on the left, you can see it's the heads of families. And it is Kings County, and it's broken down by sort of the different towns. There is Brooklyn, Bushwick, Flatbush, Flatlands, Gravesend, New Utrecht. And just to give you some context, you really are thinking about Brooklyn as being developed, but developed compared to Bushwick, Flatbush, Flatlands, Gravesend, and New Utrecht, which was extremely, extremely agricultural still. But it certainly was not the kind of downtown Brooklyn, sort of hyper-developed, gentrified, metro tech Brooklyn we think of today, right? When I'm saying developed, all I mean by that is there were a few main streets. Main Street was one of them. There was the Fulton Ferry, and that was really it. It was still very much farmland. But you can clearly see that the breakdown of this is in terms of white head of households, enslaved people, and all other free persons. And I often get asked, well, what does that all other free persons mean? It could mean a person of African descent. There really were free Black communities that existed, very small, clearly. It could mean indigenous. It could mean a few things. So, but my focus is really on the white males and the enslaved population, and to have you folks think about the numbers. Even by 1790, at the end of that revolution, when this country is founded upon liberty, independence, freedom, what you have in Kings County, again, think about Brooklyn as its own peculiar history, is something not necessarily unique, but unusual. Slavery was fortifying or growing or strengthening in Kings County and Brooklyn, and that was not the case in neighboring Manhattan. It wasn't even the case in Philadelphia, and certainly not the case in Boston. So Kings County, because of its agricultural economy, was already doing something different. And you can clearly recognize from the 1790 census, again, thinking about our landscape, thinking about the way in which things look. Most of these streets still stand today: Sand Street, Remsen, Hicks, Nostrand, Borum Hill, let's see, Cortelliu Road, Wyckoff, so many Wyckoffs in Brooklyn, Lefferts, not just streets, but neighborhoods as well. Sort of a hat tip to the fact that these were the original Dutch and later English owning families that owned that land, but also a memorialization of something that is unresolved in our histories, right? They were slaveholders. As property owners, de facto, they were also enslavers or slaveholders. And so thinking about the ways in which our landscapes really are hidden and not so hidden at all, and the ways in which they exist in our archives. It still exists around us today. It exists as anti-Blackness, police brutality, certainly in our education system. The legacy exists as the huge amounts of segregation, inequality we see. And as a CUNY professor, I stand with you. I see it myself. The myth still exists that slavery was somehow less or milder. Well, Professor Kanakamadil, if it wasn't like the Southern plantations of Southern slavery, maybe it was a better kind of slavery, as if a better kind of slavery could exist. So I just want to read a primary source that builds into or sort of buys into that fallacy, right? That myth that somehow slavery could be milder, or that slavery was somehow not as bad as it was in the South. Slavery was horrific and traumatic no matter what. And I think when we're trying to think about nuance, it's really important to have both us as educators and also as to also have our students think about nuance in absolutely particular ways, but this not being the way, right? So we know, thankfully, that slavery was horrific in Kings County because there was an enslaved person called John Jay, who we very sort of luckily have his first person account, his memoirs from, in which he will say that animals and the horses were treated better than us. And he also talks about his trauma, right? That slavery was almost so horrific that he still finds it difficult to talk about as he becomes a free man and starts traveling and sort of preaching the word of God through the Atlantic world. So I really, I urge sort of obviously nuance as a historian when we think about slavery, both in Brooklyn and New York, but to really think about how we unpack that nuance and to think about just creating a baseline in terms of language that slavery was horrific, even if a slaveholder only had, right, all of these qualifiers, 1 to 3 enslaved people. That was still brutal, and that kind of system of slavery and that brutality and that oppression still sort of has ripples in our society today. Just wanted to move on slightly to 3 key dates that are sort of key or pivotal to this narrative. And those are the dates in which slavery ended in New York State. The 3 dates are 1799, which is the date of the Gradual Emancipation Act, 1817, which was a further act, and the final end of slavery, 1827, July 4th. In 1799, New York State, again, incredibly reluctant to end slavery, passed the Gradual Emancipation Act. And it stated, if you were born after July 4th, 1799, and you were male, you were an enslaved male, you would be free at the age of 28. And if you were born after July 4th, 1799, and if you were female, you would be free at the age of 25. If you were born before July 4th, 1799, slavery had no end date for you as an enslaved person. So to have yourselves as educators and your students thinking about the ways in which New York State and New York, and certainly Brooklyn, really did hold on to slavery. It took 28 oppressive years for slavery to end. And when it did, there were very few enslaved people waiting to be freed, right? The idea that enslaved people really sort of grabbed their own freedom. Enslaved people really sort of grabbed their own freedom. In 1817, when the writing was on the wall and New York State could clearly see slavery was on the wane throughout the North, other northern states, they're actually precedented in terms of when slavery would end. New Jersey was the only last one after New York to end slavery. In 1817, New York finally gives it that end date of July 4th, 1827. And again, on July 4th, 1827, we thankfully have various accounts, the most famous of which is James McCune Smith, who would later become an abolitionist and a doctor, one of the only male doctors in the early 19th to mid 19th century here in New York. And he'll talk about that beautiful parade along Broadway in Lower Manhattan, and how people were really excited to see the end of slavery, but actually that there was a growing free Black community. And I am not saying freed with a D on the end, but it was a growing free Black community that had existed in New York throughout gradual emancipation. And those folks, certainly the thriving small free Black community in Brooklyn, were not waiting for an emancipation moment. Rather, again, they seized those moments throughout the 28 years to create freedom and moments of emancipation throughout those 28 years and beyond for themselves. As long as slavery existed, so did the desire to be free. It goes hand in hand. And nowhere did you see this more than in Brooklyn's small, extremely small, but thriving free Black community. So this free Black community lived in what we call today Dumbo. Didn't exist then, it was still the village of Brooklyn, certainly Vinegar Hill, tiny bit of downtown Brooklyn, and an even tinier bit of Brooklyn Heights. It was a free Black community, a number of men and women at the center of that. But the men would come together, 2 brothers that I always focus on, James and Peter Kroger, and that they would create these 3 pillars of what any community should look like, any sort of healthy, thriving community should look like. The first thing they formally create in terms of an institution is the Brooklyn African Woman Benevolent Society. This is just the cover page from the Constitution, which is actually printed 10 years later. But the organization itself is printed in 1810. We're talking about a time in Brooklyn's economic history, and actually neighboring New York as well, in which people of African descent were denied the opportunity to get jobs that reflected their talents and capabilities. Right, a white supremacist system, a racist system, and racial capitalism made sure that when you look at the census, a number of people of African descent, of Black New Yorkers, Black Brooklynites, were often doing jobs that was certainly working class jobs, laborers, construction workers, dock workers. Occasionally, you would find, absolutely, as the 19th century progressed, educators, businessmen and women. But the far majority of Black Brooklynites lived below the poverty line. And so, again, as part of self-determination, they created institutions in which they could thrive and survive as a community. And so the Brooklyn African Woman Benevolent Society is the first mutual aid society here in Brooklyn. There's one in neighboring New York as early as 1808, the New York African Society for Mutual Relief, but this was slightly different. This was created so that if you were a widow or an orphan of a member who had paid their dues, you would receive the monies to make sure you didn't go under the poverty line. And so thinking of ways in which, in an incredibly capitalist system, right, in which racial capitalism will always sort of foreground white supremacy, thinking of ways in which this free Black community was looking to not just survive, but thrive as a community. So that was the first thing they create in 1810. In 1815, just 5 years later, again, these two brothers, Peter and Benjamin Kroger, will put an advertisement in the Long Island Star. At this point in Brooklyn's history, it was part of Long Island still. It was Kings County in Long Island because of the geography or the shape of the land. So he puts an advertisement in the Long Island Star for an African school. And it clearly says a day and evening school is now opened at the house of Peter Kroger in James Street, Brooklyn, where those who wish may be taught the common branches of education. Again, not waiting for emancipation or freedom to be handed in any way, but just seizing it for themselves. This was a free Black community that knew education was central, right, to freedom. Literacy is liberation, education is emancipation. And so Peter Kroger goes ahead and opens it in his house. And thinking about our landscapes and the way in which stuff is erased constantly. New York is, a city of development, it always has been. My esteemed colleague, Cynthia Copeland, a public historian, says it best when she says, we are constantly, as New Yorkers, walking upon other New Yorkers who came before us, their lives, the remnants of their lives. And so James Street in downtown Brooklyn doesn't exist today. When they started building or constructing the Brooklyn Bridge, James Street was razed and there was no memorial or no plaque put to them. So an African school. So by 1815, you had a mutual aid organization to think about income. How can a family in which maybe the breadwinner has deceased, how can they survive? You then had education as emancipation, right? Let's create a private school in which we know our children, and not just children, but adults too, can get an education, in which they may be taught some of the same debates happening today, a curriculum that really reflects our needs, and educators that reflect our students. The next pillar they create for this strong community is by 1818, they will borrow from Philadelphia and create the Bridge Street. It wasn't called Bridge Street yet. In 1818, it was still very much the African Methodist Church. It will later become the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And then it will move to Bridge Street and be called the full name. Of course, today Bridge Street is still thriving. It has since moved from downtown Brooklyn, but remains one of our oldest churches today in Brooklyn. So thinking about those three pillars of a sort of energized, mobilized, organized, thriving free Black community, thinking about it in terms of assistance, education, and faith. And not just thinking about those spaces as standalone or independent, right? You went to the church to pray, you went to the school to get an education, but actually to think of these spaces in which real estate has always been premium in Brooklyn and New York. The fight for real estate, the fight for who gets remembered on that land has always been central to Brooklyn's history.